Hi guys, and welcome back to this week's episode of Let's Chat Ethics. I'm your co-host Ariana.
And I'm your other co-host Amanda. And this week we're back with the EU guidelines for Trustworthy AI. And we've got the one that we've been most excited about, bias! So I think bias is probably pretty self-explanatory. I think it's also probably the one that's been in the news sort of the most, outside of maybe privacy. And so here we actually want to talk about two kinds of bias. So we're going to do a two-parter. Today we're going to talk about the kind of bias that we learn from data. So when you've got a data set that is itself biased, either because of the way it was collected, but usually because of the way it was collected, but I mean because it was missampled, or it is based on a biased society. But there's also another kind of bias that we'll deal with next week, which is bias by design. And that's when certain groups are left out of the design or their needs are not considered, for example. But this week, like I said, we're going to focus on sort of data bias more than the other kind. And I think probably the most famous example is the Compass algorithm, which was made to predict, I think it was the likelihood of I never remember this word. The likelihood that the reoffend, the likelihood that somebody would reoffend, and it consistently predicted higher risks for people of color, specifically black people, actually, than it did for white people, even I think when the white people might have had worse crimes, actually. So I think in this case it's probably kind of clear that the source of the bias was probably the data. So as far as I know, they used existing data sets, obviously, that were collected historically, based on human judgments. And because we live in a racist society that sort of criminalizes people of color and black people more than, criminalizes maybe the wrong word, but we have an idea as a society that they're more likely to be criminals, then this was reflected in the data.
I think this, like you were saying, this guideline is probably the most spoken about in the news, or whenever something happens in AI, it usually relates to bias. And I think that's been a big problem within tech and the AI community for since it began, really. Bias. So yeah, and I think, like you're saying, it's only really reflecting the society that we're living in. So I guess if you're living in a society that is racist, then we're going to be creating, unfortunately, racist technology. So I guess it's getting to the root of the racism, as well as how we train our AI models. And I think this is something a lot of people have spoken about this. I don't think you can ever have a completely unbiased data set, whether that's not necessarily biased in terms of racism, but bias in something that you're favoring, or bias that you're always going to be leaving something out, because you can't collect every point of data from the world. And especially, I guess, with new data regulations and laws. So you can't just collect data for the sake of collecting data anymore. There's more regulations for that. Yeah, so you can never have, I don't think we'll ever be able to get a completely unbiased data set for whatever AI model, whatever we're working with. But I do think, in terms of that example with Compass, that there are many steps that they could have taken to ensure that that wasn't the case, and actually training the model way better than they were training it, using data that wasn't racist, and having different points in place. So that one is definitely could have been avoided. And I think there's been a lot of situations that could have been avoided, but there was only certain people in the room making these decisions, and again, like, only certain people collecting the data, and not having anyone there to even think about how that would have the effect like it has, and it's kind of waiting for all these things to blow up and go wrong until everyone was like, oopsie, we shouldn't have trained our models these way. So yeah, I think that's crazy.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna kind of relate this to my work a bit, because obviously it's sort of the point of view from which I can speak more wisely, I guess. But for anybody listening who doesn't know, my work is in natural language processing, and I'm doing some work on abuse detection. And one of the problems we have with abuse is that language takes up a different meaning depending on who is actually using that word. And there's recently been some work, and I've also noticed this in my work, of course, showing how toxic comment or hate speech, abuse detection, etc., these are all tend to be quite biased, because if you're not representing a particular group, so say, for example, the N-word, it obviously is hate speech and extremely racist if a white person is using it, but if you've got a black person using it, it's part of the colloquial language, and it's not a problem. But most abuse detection models would actually detect that as abusive and flag the tweet or delete the comment or something like that. And you've got similar problems with gay and other words like that, right? So how can you kind of take this into account? And one of the ways that you need to make sure that whoever's annotating your data, right? So if you're training a model, you need data that is labeled. If you're only having, say, white, heterosexual, cisgender people annotating your data set, then they will label these things in a particular way. And also, if your data is only collected from white people, right? So you only take white people's tweets, then sure, likely when they're using the N-word, it is going to be a racist word. So you need to make sure that your data set is balanced in some way, or certainly that your annotations are balanced. But the problem with these things is also there is no one sort of necessarily one label that is absolutely correct, because people have different understandings of what is abusive or what is offensive, etc. And so it's really hard, and I think one of the problems that we have with bias is also, in this case, when there is no one true value or true label for a particular case, then it's difficult, right? And that's something that I'm kind of working on right now. But I think this also extends beyond language, and I mean, another problem in NLP that I think was kind of I think it's sort of the paper that sort of kickstarted the whole thing, and it was published, I think, in 2015, and it's quite a well-known paper now called Man is to Computer Programmer, What Woman is to Housewife, I think. We can link it in the podcast information. And it was a paper showing that word embeddings are heavily biased. So word embeddings are, for anybody who doesn't know, you can take language and essentially map it into vectors. And the idea is that you can know things about the meaning of a word based on the words that it frequently appears next to. So if words are frequently together, then they will be close together in the vector space. So it's kind of cool, a sort of mathematical way of mapping words and meaning. And what's particularly cool about them is that you can actually do kind of mathematical operations. So if you take computer programmer and you subtract the vector value of man, then you end up with a vector for housemaid or housewife. I don't remember exactly which one it was. Which is really, it's terrible. It's really interesting. And to be clear, this language model is usually extracted from like an internet's worth of English language or whatever vector language you want to use. So it's kind of reflecting all the internet's language, not all of it, but a huge chunk of English, for example, and mapping it into this vector space, so you can get an idea of how words are used in English at that particular time or in that particular context.
That's crazy. That is crazy. Yeah, I've heard of that before, and it's just yeah. I feel like like we were saying last week, even when you're talking about unethical research, when we think of bias, there's so many like nuances to it, and like you were saying, like culturally, like down to race as well, down to the society you're living in, like who's training the data sets, who's working with it. So it is hard to think of, like we were saying, somewhere that would a society where we don't have completely unbiased tech. But and like you're saying with the language, I think that's really, I mean, really crazy. But I guess it's reflecting what's been happening on the internet with having seeing the housewife. That's just, yeah, that is wild, but a reflection of, I guess, the society we've lived in for many years. It's going to be a bit sexist, really. And again, what you were saying about the training in natural language processing, that is wild when you think of it, and going back to saying that, can we really actually get completely unbiased data sets, and the annotating, like you're saying, obviously there is obvious steps there where we could have less bias, and we could have a more wide range understanding in terms of the data sets that you're using. So um, do you think though that by having different people in the room, that's going to actually solve the issue? So say we have actual diversity in terms of race, like cultures. Do you think that will actually solve the problem in like NLP, for example, with hate speech?
I don't know that it's going to completely solve the problem, because there's ultimately a kind of technical problem there, right? That the models are going to predict something that is more or less likely, and it's really hard. So I went to a talk once where the person giving the talk said the only word that doesn't have multiple meanings is attorney. Yeah. So that makes it extremely hard. And even if we had, even if you have different annotations and different people in the room who are testing the system and stuff, there is still going to be this kind of technical problem of actually making the detection. And how it's going to be solved, I'm not sure yet. I think if I did, I would have finished my PhD by now. But I think having diversity will certainly help, and it will certainly help to prevent sort of being surprised by some of the problems, right? I think always having different perspectives is very important. I don't know if you remember a few years ago, I think it's 2 or 3 years ago, Google Photos released the automatic labeling, and it was pretty horrific because it labeled pictures of black people, would label them as gorillas. Yeah, and I don't know if you know what the solution to that problem was. Google Photos no longer labels gorillas, period. It's not that it no longer labels, that it somehow managed to correct people, its labeling of black people. It's just that nothing will get predicted as being a gorilla anymore. And that's just kind of a lousy solution. But yeah, it's also partly maybe a technical problem, but I think if they had a more diverse team, they would have noticed this problem before they released the
100%. I think that's gone down to, like, in terms of even like out of tech, but even down to like marketing campaigns. And there's been so many instances where that have caused, like rightly so, a massive outrage and upset in the black community, because companies have either done a racist marketing campaign, and then they're suddenly like, oh no, we didn't think of that. And it's like, well, yeah, if you'd had black people in the room, that wouldn't have got passed. And it wouldn't have had like a team of people thinking that was okay. Because yeah, I think in anything that, like any tech or anything, think how many people these things go through. So yeah, like with the detection, doing labeling black people as gorillas, like think how before it got to that stage, how many people would have actually been involved in that process,
Exactly.
from like conception idea, like the design, everything, the whole process, even like with the data sets, everything, all the training. When you think about how many people would have been involved, and for not one person to even flag that as an issue until it went public is just, I feel like these kind of things are, to me, are kind of unforgivable, um, when you think about it. Because when you think there's making mistakes and there's only, like maybe a few people in the room, and then there's like big corporations where there are like thousands of people involved in this process, and to have not one person flag that is just, it is unforgivable.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, and then the fact that they haven't really gone out of their way to do anything profound to make, just to then be like, oh, we just won't label gorillas. It's just that is just ridiculous.
That is, I mean, to me, that's an incredibly lazy solution, right? And I recognize that the problem is hard. It's not, building a detection model is of any kind in computer vision is not easy. But if anybody can pull it off, it's Google. And if they had bothered to test this properly beforehand, if they'd had the diversity in the testers and in the data set, then this wouldn't have happened.
I was going to say, and also, if you put it bluntly, Google's like one of the richest corporations in the world. It's not like they don't have the money to be investing in training. It's not like they don't have the money at all. They've got countless amount of money. So that, yeah, there's really no excuse for these big corporations to be making such, and even to call them, like, I feel like they see them as all clumsy errors, but they're not clumsy errors. At some point, it actually gets to the point where it's like, was this almost done on purpose? Uh, there's some part where it's like, was this done to cause outrage? Because it's like, how could you miss that? Those kind of things, I'm like, we should stop looking at things as being, I guess, like clumsy mistakes, which I think a lot of time, even like the algorithm predicting, like you're saying, black people more likely to commit crimes. Like, was that actually a clumsy mistake, or was that, I guess we could say, racist by design, which we're talking about next week, like bias by design? Because there's certain things that I feel like the longer we're in this like tech community, you realize how many resources people do have. It seems like some of it must be racist by design rather than just mistakenly using wrong data sets.
Yeah, sometimes it makes you wonder. I mean, I think we've been talking about diversity and justice for such a long time that it's sometimes, frankly, quite shocking that these things are still happening.
And I think, I guess I'm more thinking about, I guess, the predicting of sentencing or likely to commit crimes. I think it's more because it's, if you look at the society we live in, I guess, if that's in America, that's just a reflection really of the fact that without the algorithm, they were like, the police were going to be predicting black people more likely to commit crimes anyway. That's what they would be doing without the algorithm. So that's why they were like, the algorithm is surely just how it was almost done on purpose, really.
Yeah, I also wonder if we fall into this pitfall of thinking that AI is quote unquote rational and, free from humanity's sins and problems of yeah. Exactly. And I think that's probably still a big part of the problem, right? That we just assume that if it's AI that's predicting it, then it must be correct, or free from any kind of bias, even though weirdly, I mean, if you think about it, the before AI, etc., we use data to study how society is. So we know that something like data is a reflection of society. So it's kind of surprising that we still think that somehow we can learn something value neutral from data that is not value neutral and can probably never be value neutral. I mean, even there's been a lot of publications trying to debias these word embeddings, and last year there was a paper showing that all the kind of debiasing methods are just kind of hiding the bias more than actually removing it. And maybe that just makes it even harder to get rid of it, because you can't measure how biased your system is. And I mean, this is a really hard problem. It's not obviously, some of the greatest minds in the world are thinking about how to solve the problem. And I'm very happy to see that there are companies, even Google, for example, that have set up some teams in their companies to try and deal with this problem. So I will give credit where credit is due. But yeah, I don't know. Yeah, sometimes I'm so shocked, but I guess.
Yeah, I think I think people are starting to take a difference, but maybe I'm more the cynical side of thinking that they're doing something because people, I guess, are putting a bit more pressure on them now. So I feel like they have to, but I wonder how much of it is performative and how much they actually taking that step. But I mean, this year we obviously did see that IBM and Amazon have decided to stop selling their facial recognition to the police forces. But again, is that a performative gesture that they're doing for now? And are we going to see something like, like the Project Maven that happened with Google a few years ago? Mm-hmm. And then it turns out they took the contracts off, and then they ended up selling the stuff anyway through like a different like loophole. So I just wonder how many of these things are performative, or how many things are actually going to actually make a difference. But I mean, there's obviously definitely people, like, take away the corporations. I have more faith in people rather than the corporations, and there are a lot of people, like individuals, who are actually trying to like actively work on this, which is obviously great to see. But yeah, like hopefully the more people that are talking about this and are actually wanting to make this different, it's going to, in the next few years, see better data and better use of data, and that's, I guess, all we can like hope for in terms of that.
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, even if it's out of sort of pressure from the public, if the companies are willing to spend the money on doing this research, then I think it's great. We can kind of hope at least that in some way capitalism can benefit society. But yeah, I think it. But yeah, I think, we were talking about companies funding and how that can affect research and stuff last week or the week before. And I think it's, in this case, probably a nice thing, right? That even if the first thing that interested companies in doing quote unquote ethical research or research into ethics is public pressure, then at least the research is getting done and it's getting funded, and maybe that's more than might happen at the academic level. Certainly the funding would be very, very reduced. So
I wonder though, talking
I don't
about,
know.
I wonder if talking about bias though, whether when we're talking about the funding from uh, funding from big like tech, like we were saying in the academic level, surely that research will be biased though. No, if you're being funded by someone, are you going to really call them out in your research? Exactly. Like for example, if they find if say an academic research finds something, like say for example you found something that's seriously unethical going on, but you're being funded by the big tech company, um, and are you able to have the autonomy to really be transparent with that in your research? Um, I mean, you as an individual could approach them, but how would that? I wonder how many times that's happened and how many times it's been maybe covered up, um, to benefit the obviously the tech company. They can't. There's certain things they can't have being leaked, I guess.
Yeah, I think the companies kind of weigh it out. So I remember, again, this must be 2 or 3 years ago now. Amazon had that algorithm to pick CVs for the people they wanted to interview for a job or something, and again, it was, for tech jobs, it was heavily biased against women, just because previously Amazon have mainly, well, all tech companies, to be clear, have predominantly hired men for tech jobs. Maybe because they tend to be the ones that apply as well. I won't comment on on that. But it was actually Amazon that chose to make this information public. And so I think to some extent they definitely weigh out the cost benefit of people finding out that a certain system might be biased. They might say like, okay, we built it, but we scrapped it. We're not using it, so we're aware and we're super woke as a company. So, but I wonder. I mean, I think if it was something very serious, I don't know. If somebody found out that like the company is on purpose, just be dramatic and say they're killing somebody, then yeah, maybe the company would be like, okay, well, if you say anything, then we'll pull the funding. That's definitely a possibility. I don't know. I have the feeling that in today they would, obviously not if they were killing people, but in terms of like finding out that a particular system is biased or not, I have a feeling that they would take more of the route of making it public themselves, and being like, we're so woke, look, we're doing research in this and we found this out, and so we're gonna do that.
Yeah, I think yeah, you would hope. I think the only worry is just like if yeah, I think my only worry was always if someone is funding someone to do research for them about their problems within their company, even if they release like, oh, we found this, but how much how much is it going to be completely transparent, I guess, about what's really going on? Because you might release a little bit to then cover up the rest, or I don't know. It seems um, yeah, murky. I guess it's murky waters, just like they were comparing it to tobacco, big
Yeah.
tobacco, and those kinds of anything. I think it always like seeps down to like every industry, doesn't it? Like even even in terms of the meat industry funding certain charities about cancer and heart disease. So and the dairy industry as well. It's all those little things that um, you kind of wonder how much transparency really goes on. But I think we're actually up on our time, you know.
Oh,
I know
I
we
actually
could.
had another type of bias I wanted to talk about.
I know. Next week, we've got our
Next week.
bias by design, and then also can speak about your other bias.
Yeah. I'm gonna break. I was just thinking about, just very briefly, but I was thinking about actually the types of bias we talk about, and I noticed that we often, like, not just you and me, Oriana, but as a community, of bias. We often talk about racial bias and gender bias and stuff, but I think we often leave out maybe class, quote unquote, bias, or like socioeconomic, I guess, bias, because, and I wonder if it's because a lot of the conversation about bias got started in the US, where there is this idea that there is no class system.
Yeah.
And so maybe people are more afraid of talking about class like that, the way that I think in the UK is more...
Oh, the UK is very classist. Yeah, actually.
It's very classist, but it's kind of more, not openly classist, but it's more accepted that there is a class system.
Yeah, it is more accepted. Yeah, like you have, like, it's very, people very openly talk about, I'm from a working class background, or I'm from, I went to private school, so I'm, from the upper class or whatever. But yeah, actually, literally thinking that was what we spoke about a bit before about, in terms of classes, was the algorithm that literally just recently happened this summer, wrongly predicting A-level results just based on a person's socioeconomic status, so by their postcode. So yeah, if anyone who didn't know, basically, if you lived in a so-called working class area, you were predicted a lower A-level result, and therefore people didn't get into their university of choice. And people who lived in more of a so-called upper class area were predicted higher results getting into their university, which is scandalous to say the least. It's awful. So yeah, that's a classist bias is definitely real in terms of algorithms and tech as well. And also another thing we don't really speak about, but this is definitely one I'm going to speak about next week, and by design, is ableism, and how a lot of the tech we see is not, the tech is not designed for people with disabilities. And I know Microsoft have been working on that a bit with a few applications. Shout out to Microsoft, because I've forgotten to get the CEO. I know he has a disabled son, actually. I really like him as far as tech CEOs go.
So yeah, anyway, I know we're running out of time, so I just wanted to point out that even our bias discussions can be biased sort of based on where we're from, and I guess we can talk about it more next week. So thank you very much for tuning in. We hope you enjoyed the episode.
Yeah, thank you for tuning in, guys. And as always, if you want to follow us on social media, we're at Let's Chat Ethics on Twitter, and we do have an email if anyone wants to reach out we would love feedback, or if you want to discuss anything. It's
any topic suggestions.
Exactly, yeah. At let's chat ethics@gmail.com.
Okay, thank you very much, and we'll see you next week.
See you next week.
Bye.